Welcome to another episode of The Wormhole. The Wormhole allows us to meet scholars and academics all over the world. I wonder where the wormhole is going to take us to today and who our mystery guest is.
Hi, Shiri. This is Salman Hameed. How are you?
This is fantastic. This is so exciting to see Professor Salman Hameed on the other end of the wormhole. And he's all the way in the United States and Massachusetts, while I'm here in Trinidad and Tobago in beautiful Caribbean. All right, so who is Professor Salman Hameed? Salman Hameed is Charles Taylor, an associate professor of integrated science and humanities at Hampshire College, Amherst in Massachusetts. He holds a PhD in astronomy from New Mexico State University at Las Cruces and a bachelor in physics and astronomy from the State University of New York at Stony Brook. His astronomy work focused on how stars form in spiral galaxies. His research interests have now moved in a sociological direction, and today his primary research focuses on understanding the reception of science in Muslim societies and how Muslims view the relationship between science and religion. He is also actively engaged in science communication and is the founder and CEO of Kainat Studios that produces astronomy content in Urdu for audiences in Pakistan. He has a YouTube channel for Urdu videos and a weekly astronomy segment in English for a radio station in Western Massachusetts. His classes focus on issues related to science, religion, and society. And his favorite class is titled Aliens, Close Encounters of a Multidisciplinary Kind. And I can't wait to sign up for that course if I can, Professor. Right? So we do have to talk about that course. But let's get started a little bit in your childhood. Did you always want to be an astronomer growing up? And give us a little background into how did you end up where you are today?
Sure. Thank you for having me. And no, I did not wanted to be an astronomer because I did not know when I was growing up in Pakistan that you could be a professional astronomer. I mean, this is just one of those things that growing up, you don't see any role models. So when I was growing up in the 70s and 80s, mostly in the 80s, you could become a doctor, you could become an engineer if you were good in math, or the new fields were coming up like MBA or chartered accountant and things like that, or computer science was the really hip field at the time. But being an astronomer was never an option. So I never thought about becoming an astronomer.
That's fascinating that this sort of thread is around the world, because even in the Caribbean, it's a very similar situation. Even today, I would meet a lot of young people who are fascinated by astronomy, but to think of it as a career, it's like literally, what can you do with astronomy? But here you are doing lots of amazing things with astronomy. So even as you took your path and became an astronomer, and today you are a major science communicator, were there like defining moments or people that you met in your life that carved your path?
Well, I mean, those two things are interrelated, because I got into astronomy after watching Carl Sagan. So his Cosmos was shown on public television in Pakistan back in 1984. And I distinctly remember watching just the first episode. And I was like, whoa. Two things. One, astronomy is amazing. And secondly, you can be an astronomer. There is a professional astronomer on television talking about that. That's what he does. And so for me, that was definitely a defining moment. And one of the reasons I wanted to get a PhD in astronomy was not to become an Einstein or Stephen Hawking or others. I mean, partly because I thought I was never that smart, but partly because I really was amazed at how Carl Sagan communicated science and how he impacted me at a personal level. And so one of the reasons I wanted to get a PhD was so that I can communicate astronomy. communicate science, but I knew that in order to do it properly, I will myself have to have background in it. And for that, I need to get a PhD. So in some sense, it's a sort of like, ends justifying the means in some ways, like, because I needed to get a PhD in order to communicate science. But of course, when you start doing a PhD, as you know, Chiri, as well, that you get sucked into the actual phenomenon science as well. And so there are all these detours, not to mention that, like, that it took me, I think, 16 years after I first watched Cosmos to actually get a PhD. So it's a long journey, and there are ups and downs and all of those things. But I think the primary reason I always remembered was because of Carl Sagan's Cosmos and that particular episode.
You have no idea how your story touches my heart. But what amazes me here is that a program like that, one individual, over and over, I meet so many people who were inspired by that one person in a particular field. So the point that you raised, the importance of actually doing a PhD to be able to communicate science as best as you could. And what's really very interesting too, is that it reached people in certain corners of the world. There in Pakistan, you were influenced, and here's where you are. Here in the Caribbean, I watched Cosmos. I taped every episode. I still have them on VHS. Yes, young people out there used to be something called VHS tapes. So that's remarkable. And in a way, to me, you are carrying on his legacy. But the fascinating twist I find is that you have your YouTube channel, which I mentioned when I introduced you. Tell us about your YouTube channel. What inspired you to do it, and the audience that you are reaching?
Right. So, I think, as I mentioned, this is something that I had always wanted to do, to communicate science, to communicate the joy and wonder of science, in some sense. And while I was doing a PhD in the US, or even before that as my undergrad in physics and astronomy, I still gave public talks in Pakistan. I would go back. And one of the things was, as you mentioned, Carl Sagan influenced so many people. And one of the reasons I wanted to do astronomy was because I could see him as a model. Yeah, there could be somebody who can actually be a professional astronomer. So in my mind, it was really important to communicate that particular aspect to audience in Pakistan and South Asia as well, that, hey, look, if he can do astronomy PhD, so can you. And and it's not something completely alien. So that's the reason in some ways, I started making videos, and videos were in Urdu. And for that, the reason is because you have local cultural contexts. You have, apart from the fact that not everybody speaks English. In Pakistan, yes, because of the colonial legacy, there is English over there, but still it's more limited to the upper middle to upper classes. It's for the elites. And so I wanted to reach a broader audience. But I think more than that, even for audiences that do have access to today, Neil deGrasse Tyson or Bill Nye the Science Guy, my point was that if I am giving an example, if I am using something in terms of, say, for example, oftentimes people talk about in astronomy examples, if neutron star is as big as New York City. Well, sure, that's great. But it means something else if I say New York City is something like Karachi, right? There is this ownership that comes in within the same science, and that breaks a little bit of a barrier. I'm not saying that it completely breaks barrier. It breaks a little bit of a barrier, and people feel that, okay, well, this is something that's not completely alien. Not to mention that what I find that people feel that I'm guessing that's the case, but people feel less intimidated to send me a comment or send me an email compared to, for example, if there is Neil deGrasse Tyson, who is from another culture, or Bill Nye from another culture, and so on and so forth. But they would feel like, hey, I have a question, which I do get, and I try my best to respond to comments and things like that. So I think there are multiple reasons for this channel that I started, and frankly speaking, I didn't know if people were going to respond to that or not. I mean, this is on my side what I wanted to do, but I got a reasonable response. So I mean, I think there may have been a need for that.
But I have a little story for you, Salman. I know you're thinking about your audience in Pakistan, those that probably are not that proficient with English. I don't know if you realize that you have touched a particular base, and this is a particular personal story. I showed your video to my mom, and she's 86 years old, and she speaks Urdu. So I said, Mom, I'm going to have a guest on my show, and his channel is Kainati, from Kainati Studios, and so on. And she says, oh, in Urdu, of course, that's all about the universe and everything that's around us. And I put on one of the episodes for her, and she was so engaged that I wanted to take a photograph of her. She's 86 years old, watching it. She speaks primarily Urdu, of course, and but she had my phone, so I couldn't take a picture of her doing it. But so I think I'm going to have to just set it back up and do that. But it was really heartrending for me that I don't know if you realize that even among the elderly people, because of the language, they want to understand and know about the universe, and they may not have access to it as easily in other languages. So that's
Thank you so much. I really appreciate your story, and please convey my regards to your mom as well. But I think you had also asked what was the goal behind the channel, and just like Cosmos, again, I would come back to it because as my role model, they are not meant to be lectures on sort of like astronomy subject matter. They're not meant to prepare you for college. They're not meant to be courses. They are not meant to be for kids, right? The goal is that how do you think about the universe? The pleasure of finding out about how do we know the universe is expanding, for example, or how stars are forming. And so for that, I mean, I absolutely love your story. And occasionally I do get comments like, my favorite ones are about when they say, hey, I watch it with my parents. Saying like, I mean, that's, to me, that's the most amazing thing, because that's the primary goal, that it's not driven by that, oh, this is aimed for kids, or is this going to prepare me for a class? No, these are meant to really, I hope my goal is to really think about our place in the universe.
That's fantastic. And even as you talked about the pleasure of finding things out, you remind me of my next favorite scientist, Richard Feynman. So I think he has a book called The Pleasure of Finding Things Out. If you can spark that curiosity in a child, in anyone, it's remarkable. And well, like I said, that is your story. Carl Sagan sparked that curiosity in you that paved your path, and now you are doing back exactly the way he touched your life. All right, so let me just move a little bit to the area that you studied in, which of course is astronomy. So over your time in astronomy, has there been any development that has been like mind-blowing to you, or changes that you've seen happen? I can easily say since Carl Sagan's time to where we are now in 2021.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and it's funny that you asked me this question, because James Webb Space Telescope is about to be launched, and I've been thinking a lot about that. And I think on two extreme ends, my PhD work more focused on how stars form in spiral galaxies. And I remember Hubble Space Telescope being really important in the 90s when its first results were coming out of some of the nebulae, the famous one, the Pillars of Creation, for example, or Orion Nebula. And we had never seen images like this before. I actually remember, because that was a transition. I was an undergrad. I started my graduate school in 1994. So Hubble Space Telescope images had just started to come into play, because initially it was flawed. And so the mirror had to be worked out, and so on and so forth. And there used to be sketches, or there used to be schematics in textbooks that would talk about star forming regions. And they would be sort of like, sketched out, well, this is how we look like. And then they would have ground-based images that give you the Orion Nebula or something like that. And then there was the first images of these objects from the Hubble Space Telescope. And they were unbelievable. I mean, literally, that changed the way we thought about star formation. And while I was in graduate school, we started to think differently about these things and about the details we see. But that said, I mean, that's what I love, how stars form in galaxies. But I think if you are talking about big changes, I mean, I think the image from Hubble Space Telescope about the Hubble Deep Field, when it looked at a tiny fraction of the sky, 1/100th the size of the full moon, which we didn't know there were any galaxies. It was a blank piece of sky from ground-based telescopes. And then Hubble stared at it for 140 hours, and it revealed thousands of galaxies in that tiny blank piece of sky. To me, that image, I think, defines this era where it turns out that the universe that we live in is much grander than we ever imagined it to be, and that we can have the tools to investigate that grandeur. So I think that is amazing. And if I can just add one more thing, because it's just such an amazing question, and that is about exoplanets. Again, first time we started detecting, especially around sun-like stars, was in 1995. And now we know more than 4,000 confirmed exoplanets. And that's in the last roughly 25 years. So I think that is something that's unbelievable.
You make me emotional just hearing you talk about all of these. Well, how inspiring it is to hear you speak about the astronomy. And when you said there were like these thousands of galaxies, and in my mind, I'm thinking, Salman, I got to get you to say Carl Sagan's famous, well, his last book, I think you know where I'm going. His last book, which his wife finished off, Billions and Billions. I was almost expecting to hear you say there, let's hear you.
You see, that's his signature term. So I cannot say billions and billions. It will never have that Brooklyn accent. So I'm bringing in Pakistani accent. So it's really, I don't know what happens to that.
I'm so glad you didn't say billions and billions. So we have to catch up on that. All right. So as our audience has already picked up, your training is in astronomy, but you are very much a science communicator, and your research area actually is like an intersection between humanities and science. And for many people, we tend to be streamlined into either the humanities or, particular fields. How has the crossover been for you? And like, what value does it add being mixing fields like that?
Well, I mean, it's first of all, I mean, it's not. I would be lying if I say, oh, it's great, it's easy. No, I mean, it's again, my journey into that direction had to do with liberal arts colleges. I actually when after I went to as straightforward colleges as possible. I went to a big state university, Stony Brook in New York, and then big state university in New Mexico. So I had never even known what a liberal arts college is, and I came from Pakistan. But for my postdoctorate fellowship, I got a very unique fellowship that was shared between a big state university, UMass, University of Massachusetts in Amherst, and Smith College. This is one of the 5 colleges in Massachusetts. And that was the first time I was introduced to a liberal arts environment. And my fellowship was such that I had to develop a course. So the rest of it was my research, continue working on star formation. But one part was to develop a course called Astronomy and Public Policy, which was unusual at the time. And I was like, okay, that's interesting, right? And the reason I got interested in that part was because in my graduate school, I actually TA'd a course called Revolutionary Ideas in Science. And I really loved that course. And in some sense, I had started thinking a little bit more broadly from astronomy to general sciences and how people think about these ideas. And so when this opportunity came along for this particular fellowship, I was like, yeah, astronomy and public policy, that sounds really interesting. I would like to go on how government funding interacts, how issues that are about astronomy impact society. And I think that's, as when I was there, I was at Smith College with this fellowship for 4 years. And by the end of the fellowship, I was just like, I want to be in a liberal arts environment because I absolutely loved having conversations at lunch with a philosopher or a linguist or a historian. Whereas in astronomy graduate school, you don't even talk to physicists because you're like, oh yeah, that's too far. Like, so and there is a lot of value to that. But I think I really enjoyed my time. And so when I was applying for faculty positions, I was looking for positions that are in liberal arts environment. And so I was extremely fortunate to get a faculty position in the same area, physically, geographically. And it was at Hampshire College to it. But I should mention one thing, because you mentioned whether it's easy or hard. It is always easy in the beginning when you don't know anything. You go like, oh yeah, I know this stuff. This stuff doesn't seem that hard. Like, you can jump into another field. But what happens, and that happens over and over again because you keep on moving into those directions, you actually, once you start to know the field, that's when you realize how much you don't know. You always think you know when you actually don't know. But when you start figuring it out, you go like, oh, there is actually a deep scholarship in there. And so the one way I approach that, or I try to approach that, I always have worked with collaborators in those fields. And that really helped. I would co-teach courses. I have co-taught a lot of courses, philosophy, history of science, astrobiology, and a bunch of other fields. And that helps because then you are working with people who actually know their stuff and you are learning from them.
Seeing a fascinating example of crossing across boundaries. And as you sort of mentioned, new ideas can really only come with that discussion with people in other fields and expertise crossing over. And that's really, really amazing. And I mean, given the amount of time we tend to have on planet Earth, it's very difficult for any one person to be, an expert in everything. Unlike in the time of Galileo, and I always say they were medical doctors, they were philosophers, scientists, mathematicians, they could do it all. But of course, today with the amount of knowledge and information out there, this is not an easy task. So we see the importance of multidisciplinary, interdisciplinary thought into really making breakthroughs. That's fascinating. And you talked about courses that you had to develop and so on. So I'm not going to let you go at all without you telling us about your course on aliens. And I understand it's a very popular course. So what makes it so popular? Let's hear about it.
Okay, so this is, as I've mentioned, I mean, this is my favorite course, and usually it's students also like this course. So I developed it about, I would say, 12, 13 years ago. And it keeps on changing. Every year I modify it, depending upon, especially in terms of readings. So let me tell you how it got developed. I am interested, as you know, in terms of science and also critical thinking. How do you evaluate being an astronomer? Of course, the pet peeve of astronomers is they say, hey, are you an astrologer? No, an astronomer, so this is a pet peeve. So I initially developed a course and taught a course actually with a psychologist, which was more on critical thinking. It was called Paranormal Supernormal Phenomena, a passionate closer look. And it was more about why people believe in things and why they're wrong. It was about astrology, it was about UFOs, it was about psychics, and so on and so forth. But what I quickly learned in there was that critical thinking is not much fun, especially because if it really relates to people's beliefs as well. As a scientist, you go like, psychics don't make any sense, which they don't. right? But somebody may have lost someone, like, and they are really trying to make sense of it. Now, the problem is not with somebody believing in psychics. The problem is the psychics that are trying to con people, right? So, but if you are teaching a course about, no, you shouldn't believe in psychics, sometimes what I found in my experience was that sometimes it was hard. And then also how people think about these things. So what was going on was within a class, because I would also do evaluations pre and post course, people who believed in astrology, for example, would still believe in astrology, but they would become very skeptical about UFOs or psychics. People who believed in UFOs would still believe in UFOs, but they would become more skeptical about astrology or other things, right? So I had to really evaluate. I was like, but this is not, A, this is not successful, and B, I may be defining success in the wrong way. Right? So I decided, I got fascinated by more about the sociological elements that impact rather than purely psychological. And there is a distinction between those two. I was coming in more from interest in psychology of belief, then I became more the social factors that shape persons, what people find important. So then I developed this course called Aliens, where I actually don't deal with critical thinking at all. What I tend to do is, let's look at historical claims. So I spent the first month on historical claims about unidentified flying objects, meaning to say, and there have been claims from the first wave of UFOs were in 1896, and they look like cigar shaped. But then the shapes changed, and then it turned into saucers. And in fact, flying saucers were not first observed. It was the person who observed it was defining how he saw the lights moving. And the people said, how were they moving? And he said, they were kind of moving like a saucer skips on water. The headline came, pilot sees a flying saucer. And then people started seeing flying saucer. Right? So I think that's fascinating. So what I try to do now is like, so we would spend some time on the history of the claims of flying saucers and how they have changed over a period of time. We would spend the time on perception. Can we be fooled when we look up in the sky? And then we also spend time on alien abductions. Why do people believe they were abducted by aliens? We do look at psychology. We do look at sort of like, physiological phenomena. And then we also spend time, a little bit time on actual astronomy. How do astronomers think about search for life in the universe? And then towards the end, we finish it off with looking at religions that are based upon UFOs, like Scientology or Raelians, and even sort of like Nation of Islam and things like that. So we and then we also look at what kind of an impact an alien contact may bring. What is the significance of that, so on and so forth. So it becomes this class which is about different disciplines, all united by the theme of aliens. And when people look at it from so many different angles, what I have discovered is that without even talking about critical thinking, people become more skeptical about the claims of UFOs, because people actually realize how big of a claim it is. And to say, hey, what is this? I don't know what it is. It must be a flying saucer from another planet. And that doesn't make any sense. And so that's how and as you can see, because it touches so many different fields and because it addresses different areas, it can always be changed every year. And that's what I try to do, because last year there was a New York Times report about UFOs, or claim by a Harvard astronomer that this Oumuamua, the interstellar comet, was an alien. So you have all of these things that come in space. So I spend time, let's look at that rather than shying away from it. No. No. Why do most astronomers are like sort of like, are skeptical about it. And so what are the reasons behind it? So anyway, so yeah, so here is my spiel regarding this class.
Yes, I can listen to you forever. And like I say, I'm deeply interested in that course. So I'm sure I'm asking on behalf of my audience. So does one have to, is that course limited to the university students only, or have you thought of going online, an online version of that course?
But right now it is an at Hampshire college, which is also a alternative to liberal arts colleges. We don't even have sort of like, these written lectures. I don't read it from it. It's oftentimes it's driven by discussion, right? So it's a hard course in general for an general audience. But I do hope. I really feel passionate about this subject. I find it really interesting, and it also connects to Carl Sagan because he was really interested in this topic as well. And it also connects to my research about sort of like how people think about science and religion. And so it's about science and meaning, and people find meaning with extraterrestrials as well, including religious meaning. And so there are issues that I really find fascinating, both academically and from a science popularizing perspective. So who knows? Maybe at some point I can turn it into sort of like a course-like thing online. But I cannot promise.
So from those of us in the Caribbean and all over the world, we urge you to consider it. It really is fascinating. There is so much interest now with the developments in astrobiology. And I've had other astronomers in some other episodes, and I've actually asked them that. What has been one of the most biggest discovery that you think? And it keeps converging to even the same thing you said, the discovery of exoplanets. And naturally, if there's so many exoplanets, the idea of life is out there is getting a bigger hold. Over the years, as I've been teaching astronomy myself, I have found that if I do a survey in my classes, how many people think that there is life out there in the universe, the numbers have started to shift, Salman. More than a decade ago, it would be very low. And I notice that the younger students nowadays, more and more of them are inclined to believe that there must be life out there. And as you spoke about UFOs, I'm not going to let you get away without giving me your thoughts on this one. Footages have been coming out of objects that are really behaving very strange. Simply, what's your take on it?
We don't know. I think that is something that scientists are quite comfortable with saying, that we don't know. But just because we don't know doesn't mean that it is something. And so that footage, does that qualify as evidence for a spacecraft visiting from another planet? No, absolutely not. But is it something interesting? Well, yeah, maybe, but we don't know. And I should mention, I actually did, because of my class, I've actually done a pretty deep dive into this, and including when it was first reported by the New York Times. Some of this footage was from 2004, and then some of the footage was from 2015. And it is actually, this is a prime example of terrible journalism, not about terrible science. It's about terrible journalism, because they actually had a lot of problematic sources in the newspaper article. It was a front page story in the New York Times in 2017 when it first came out. And as you know, since I teach this class, I was inundated when the story came out. And so I've been following it pretty closely. And one of the things, and I myself was very excited about it. I was like, maybe this is it. Front page story on the New York Times. They must have more than just these flying things. And at that time, this flying saucers actually was not the key component of result. In fact, one of the things they had claimed in the 2017 article was that the people also have artifacts from these crashed things. And I read that, and as you can imagine, I read it very closely, because I was like, okay, so why are they making these claims? Because these videos at that time were from 2004. I was like, this is a game changer, because if they have artifacts from these things, and they said that several $1 million, I forgot, I think it was about $20 million were spent to modify buildings that housed these artifacts. And I looked at that, I was like, this is a game changer. And there were 3 people that wrote the article. So the byline, I was like, they must have seen it. New York Times is not going to report on something. 3 people there, they're not going to make a claim if they haven't seen it. Then I followed up, and they had, because the newspaper article actually got a lot of views, as you can imagine. And they were interviewed, the authors were interviewed of that article. And they said, like, well, we have never seen those, but there are claims of that. I was like, wait a minute. This is a huge thing. I thought that was the biggest line of evidence, and they're not seeing it. Anyway, long story short, New York Times kept on publishing a UFO story pretty much every few months because it sold well. It was a very high-ranking stories whenever it came out. In 2019, and I've followed every single story that have come in New York Times since then. Every few months, there would be a story. In 2019, there was another story, and in the middle of that, there were 2 lines, and that said that the original claims of artifacts turn out to be, when under lab conditions, turn out to be of human origin. That's it. 2 lines in 2019 about this disclaimer, about a claim that they had artifacts. So you go like, okay, so, and then they went on with the stories. They have kept on going with the stories. But that disclaimer, so you go like, okay, wait a minute. But shouldn't that be a bigger story that in 2017, there were claims that, and the same people who are claiming about aliens and UFO, they are the same people who had claimed that they had recovered artifacts from flying saucers, turn out to be of human origins. And New York Times still kept on publishing and keeps on publishing these things. And then because it was in New York Times, the Congress got involved and said, hey, how come we don't know about it? Let's do a hearing. So now Congress did a hearing. New York Times reported that Congress is doing a hearing, and now it has become its own thing because now it's important because the Congress has actually asked the Pentagon to talk about it. Right. They have asked them because New York Times had a story about it. So you see this, how the story has developed, but in actuality, nothing really has changed.
And I myself did not understand that sort of path that it took. And it's actually very unnerving. It's very scary in terms of people who cannot judge any of the validity of something on what we choose to believe. And as we are on this line of path where science and sensationalism and pseudoscience is starting to merge like that, because I actually remember when 2012 was coming around and the whole thing that the world was once again going to end. I've survived several endings of the world by now. And you could get so much material on the pseudoscience of the world ending and so little on really what the Mayan calendar was saying, that it was the end of their long count calendar. So it's a scary place, and more than ever, we need voices like yours to be able to help us mesh through the things. And I'm going to ask you about one more thing that has come into the mix. And again, once I was teaching very randomly, I said something like, does anybody believe the world is flat? Right? I just threw it randomly, and one student put up her hand. I was so taken aback that all I could say was, could you see me after class? Since then, Salman, I started taking a poll if I am talking in schools or among my students, and the number is growing. The number of people who are unsure, and I am talking about university students. It's really a concern. What do you think? I mean, I call it the rise of the flat earthers. They have conferences which hundreds of people are attending, and you will see a conference on really amazing astronomy or science with a room full of maybe 15, 20 people. What's going on? I mean, you're the perfect person to address this.
Well, I would say two things. One is that we should acknowledge that nobody, even in the ancient past, by nobody, I mean most people, did not believe that the earth was flat because they could see the curvature of the earth. There are a lot of ways to see curvature of the earth, including ships and things like that. So this notion that the earth is flat, or that especially within the Christian context, that the church used to believe that the earth was flat, was actually made up. That was made up in the 18th and 19th century. And in fact, it could be traced to author Irving Washington, who actually wrote the Tales of the Cordoba as well, and so on and so forth. He was the American writer. And he had written about that the church actually believed that flat earth, but actually that is not the case, right? So because it was common sense that earth is not flat, there are many different ways to see that. And as you can imagine, we are not the only smart species. In the past, we were also there and really smart, even if we didn't know much. But that type of thing, flat earth, I mean, that's just was never there. There are many ways. And in fact, the earth's circumference was measured by Eratosthenes, for example, in the 2nd century AD, and other people, and so on and so forth. You can also see the earth's shadow as a curvature on the moon, and so on and so forth. So again, that's not the issue. Your question is about, okay, so why do we have the rise of flat earthers today? Well, I would say that there are two things to that. One is because of the internet. You can actually have any idea, and that can actually get traction, which under normal circumstances, it won't. Second thing is that science has become so complicated. I mean, I have a cell phone. I have no clue. How does it work? I don't know how it works. It's too complicated, right? Now, we are communicating with this. How does the computer work? I don't know. Actually, satellite, it's coming through. Things are so complicated that it's very hard to understand. Everything looks like magical, right? And yet it does happen. So in some sense, there is this, you have this untethering. Like, if it's magical, then everything is magical, right? I mean, so because we don't know, I cannot explain it. And so this notion that I can intuitively figure out how something is, it becomes very hard. And so this is a reaction to that. And one reaction to that is like, you know what, I'm going to reject the very foundation of it, right? But remember, they're not rejecting a number of things that sort of like would contradict flat earth, meaning to say this communication as well. They would have a conference over Zoom about how is the signal coming in. So it's not, and that's what I learned on my research as well, and thinking about this aliens class as well, that it's not about logic and reasoning. And you go like, right, but I mean, you can show them. Yeah, but I mean, those evidences are around all the time. It's not that they cannot find another the contradiction to their ideas. It's not that there is any shortage of proofs that Earth is actually not. We are dealing with the wrong thing if we are focusing on, hey, I can show you Earth is not flat. That's not what is driving the reason why people believe a flat Earth. They're driven potentially, oftentimes, by just thumbing the nose of technology and science that is so dominant. It's not that Earth is flat, it's just that they want to say that the Earth is flat, and they may believe that. And so you cannot change their view. It's a belief. Third thing I would say, it's fun. Like, it also gets a rise out of people. So what? Yeah, I'm a flat earther, and you get all this reaction. Some people enjoy that, right? And so do they really believe it? Some people, it doesn't matter. I don't care, right? So again, we would say, yeah, but I mean, as a scientist, and this is something that you want to do, as a scientist, you want to have a consistent view. Everything, you try to be, not that everybody is consistent, because scientists are humans too, but we try to have a consistent viewpoint. But for many people, it doesn't matter, right? I mean, that, okay, so I do and go, and so evolution is a great example. You have medical doctors who reject evolution, and you go like, how can you reject evolution? I mean, evolution is foundational to how humans are connected, or evolutionary medicine is so important, right? But that's not the point. You can actually still do a lot of stuff, and still reject evolution, because that's a matter of faith. If you do, I mean, just to be clear, most doctors do accept it, and most religious people also accept it. But I'm just saying, I'm just giving you an example, or it's an example of a mechanic who says, I don't believe in thermodynamics. Sure, but he would be totally fine fixing a car. Because if thermodynamics can mean something different, then it's a different category, right? As a scientist, you go like, yeah, but I mean, if you don't believe in thermodynamics, you cannot understand the universe. Well, yeah, so that's a connection because we are trying to understand the universe. So there is a different frame of thinking. For some people, it doesn't matter. So in my mind, some flat earthers, it's not a matter of science. It's not a matter of evidence. It's a matter of faith, or it's a matter of, and that faith or that reason to say that you accept flat earth, there can be many different reasons behind it, but lack of evidence is not one.
Our conversation is truly showing us how complex the human mind is. And in a way, I think the fact that science developed in the last couple hundred years as it has shows you how difficult it must have been for the early scientists, scholars, to break through that kind of mindset of what you believe, your core belief systems and things like that. It's remarkable. It's remarkable. I can talk to you for hours and hours. But Salman, on the wormhole, one of the things our audiences enjoy knowing about the scholars is a little bit about what makes them tick and what, interesting things about them. So I have some signature questions for you that we always ask, and I'm going to throw them at you now. And one of it is, what superpower do you wish that you had?
I think as a superhero, I would love to fly into space where you don't get disintegrated or be frozen, and be able to see those nebulae that I was mentioning about, that we only see through a telescope, and those are spectacular images on that scale. I would love to have a superpower where I could fly in space and be there and just look at them. I was like, that's all I will do with my superpower. I'll just go and look at different nebulae, star-forming regions, planetary nebulae, or maybe galaxies, and just hang out. Pretty boring as a superhero power, but I think I would like it.
Not boring at all, because you don't just want to fly on planet Earth. It's not good enough for you. You are going to fly right through the universe. Good luck. If you find a wormhole, come and give me a shout. How that worked out. Okay, and if you could, again, the wormhole concept comes up, could go through a wormhole through time and space, if possible, and have a conversation with anyone in the past, living, dead. Who would you like to have a conversation with?
I mean, so I would actually, again, because of my myopic vision regarding that, I mean, I never got a chance to in person meet Carl Sagan. He actually died in '96, and I was waiting to get my PhD first to then meet him, and it was too late by that time. But the reason I would meet him would not simply be to say, hey, I mean, it's amazing how this happened, but rather the US and actually British as well, science communicators that were, when I grew up, Carl Sagan, Stephen Jay Gould, and Richard Dawkins. I mean, I think those were the big threes in that sense. And I mean, I think the science communication took a turn for the worse post 9/11 here in the US, especially somebody like Richard Dawkins. Stephen Jay Gould also died pretty early in 2000s. And I've always wondered that, and there was a particular reason, the new atheism came along, and which had a deeply Islamophobic strain within it as well. I am really curious of how Carl Sagan would have responded to both 9/11 and also to this strain of new atheism, which became tied to science popularizers as well. And so I don't know what he would say, but that would be something that I would like to have a conversation about, to see how you think about that aspect, because that is not something that I know his views on, because climate change or nuclear issues, those things, he was talking about those from way back, but a much more complex cultural imperialism, which became part of science communication stuff with Richard Dawkins, Sam Harris, Christopher Hitchens, Dan Dennett, and others. I think that was a very particular type of thing which split up science communication community as well. So I would have liked to know how Carl Sagan would think about that.
That will certainly be very fascinating. And now I am developing some superpowers of telepathy, because I was like trying to guess, I wonder who Salman would like to meet. And I'm like, I feel Carl Sagan is somewhere on that list. Yeah. Okay, so our last question for our session today, and this is simply, what's your message to the world?
Well, that's just a very humble question that you have asked. What's the message to the whole world? I don't know. I mean, I think the easier one is to say, just be curious. Like, the slow, like, just be interested. I don't care what you are interested in. Just be interested, right? Like, about how the world works. But I think, and some of the themes that we have talked about, and you can imagine sort of like, there is a connecting thread to that. I think right now, the biggest concern for the world is not lack of information, but instead how to evaluate information. So I would say, like, figure out, be curious and figure out ways on how you can get the best information. And that, I think, is going to be the biggest challenge. I would say climate change, but I think in order to deal with any significant challenge, including climate change or others, you have to figure out how to get the right information. And I think in this age of information, that's the biggest thing. So figure out, how do you get yourself trained? Figure out, how do you figure out what is correct from incorrect?
That's just brilliant. I mean, your message, and almost what sounds to me just 2 words, be curious. And I loved that notion that you said, that we don't have a shortage of information today, but it's how we evaluate that information. So on that note, Professor Salman Hameed, it has been an absolute pleasure having you join us on this episode of The Wormhole. Thank you for virtually visiting us in Trinidad.
Thank you so much. And I wish I was there, because the weather is certainly much cooler here. As you can see, I'm wearing a sweater here. So I would love to be there.
Absolutely. Yes. The beaches will welcome you. So folks, with that, it's a sign off from me, Sharon Hack, your host on The Wormhole, and we will see you another time for a future episode. Bye.